The man in the hoodie was a warm afternoon on the campus of MIT. Students rushed between classes, the hum of ambition buzzing in the air, in one of the grand lecture halls, the kind where bright minds gathered and reputations were built. Professor James Winston was preparing for another round of academic battle. He was a legend in his field: genetics, evolution, and molecular biology. Strict, brilliant, and proud, he was the kind of man who didn't tolerate nonsense. Today, he had something special planned, a lecture on the complexity of gene expression, and he was excited to challenge even his brightest students. But across campus, unnoticed and unbothered, a quiet man stepped out of a rideshare car. He wore a faded hoodie, dark jeans, and walked with a kind of peace that only life experience could offer. His name was Keanu Reeves. Keanu wasn't here to act in a film. He wasn't here to speak to crowds or take photos. He had signed up anonymously to sit in on a guest biology seminar, a chance for the public to observe some of the country's best teaching. What no one knew, not even the professor, was that Keanu had once been deeply fascinated by biology. Before the movies, before the fame, before the grief that shaped him, biology was his escape. He used to stay up late in school studying cells and the way DNA made everything come alive. It brought him comfort when the world felt too big or too broken. As he walked into the hall, he took a seat in the back row, away from the crowd of eager students. Nobody gave him a second glance. To them, he was just another older man auditing the class, probably someone's dad or a lost tourist. But he didn't mind. He was here to listen, to learn, and maybe, just maybe, to feel something again. Professor Winston entered the room like a storm, tall, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for humiliating those who dared to speak without perfect knowledge. He scanned the crowd with a smirk. Today, he began, we're going to discuss a real problem. Not something from a textbook. Something real, something complex. Who here thinks they're smart enough to solve it? Silence. The students knew better than to raise their hands. No volunteers? The professor mocked. That's disappointing. Well then, how about you? He pointed to the back row. Keanu looked up, surprised. He hesitated. Me? Yes, you, the professor said with a raised eyebrow. You've been sitting there all quiet. Let's see if you're just a seat warmer or if you can actually think. A few students snickered. The spotlight was on. Keanu could have said no. He could have left, but something inside him stirred, something old, something alive. He stood up, walked calmly to the front, and faced the whiteboard. The professor handed him a marker and posed the question. A patient presents with a mutation in the BRCA1 gene, but there's no family history of breast or ovarian cancer. However, further sequencing reveals a non-coding RNA fragment suppressing p53 transcription. Explain the molecular consequence of this interaction and the potential treatment pathway. The room went silent. The question wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Even the grad students looked stunned. The professor crossed his arms, expecting confusion, maybe stammering, maybe a walk of shame back to the seat. But Keanu didn't blink. He stared at the whiteboard, closed his eyes for a second, and began to draw. First, a rough diagram of the cell nucleus, then the gene interaction. He explained in slow, simple words that the non-coding RNA likely came from an epigenetic anomaly, maybe an environmental trigger that downregulated the p53 tumor suppressor. Without p53, damaged cells could multiply unchecked, increasing cancer risk even without BRCA1's usual patterns. He suggested RNA interference therapy to block the suppressor RNA, combined with CRISPR-based gene editing to restore p53 function. His words were calm, precise, human. You could hear a pin drop in the room. When he finished, he handed the marker back to the professor, then quietly turned to walk back to his seat. But Professor Winston didn't move. He just stared at the whiteboard, blinking, stunned. Who are you? He asked. Keanu smiled gently and said, just someone who used to love biology. A girl in the front row whispered, was that Keanu Reeves? Gasps spread. A few students fumbled with their phones, but Keanu just raised his hand kindly. Please, no photos. I just wanted to learn again. The professor cleared his throat. For the first time in years, he looked humbled. That was the best answer I've heard in 10 years. Keanu nodded and quietly sat back down. But what no one knew yet, not the professor, not the students, not even Keanu himself, was that this quiet moment was just the beginning of something much bigger. Because this encounter would soon spread far beyond the walls of that classroom, setting off a chain of events that would test humility, ignite old passions, and bring strangers together in ways none of them could expect. Asterisk the ripple effect. After the lecture ended, the students trickled out of the hall still whispering. No one knew what to make of what they had just seen. Some said it couldn't be real. Others pulled up images of Keanu Reeves on their phones and compared them to the man who had just solved a complex biology problem without hesitation. But whether they believed it or not, one thing was clear: something unusual had just happened, and it left a mark. Professor Winston didn't leave immediately. He sat at his desk in silence, replaying the moment again and again in his mind. He had spent decades teaching, pushing students to the edge of their understanding, often without kindness. But today, he had seen something that cracked through his ego, a man who didn't need praise or power, just the chance to learn. It made him feel small and ashamed. He opened his laptop and searched Keanu Reeves' biology background. He expected nothing. After all, Keanu was known for action films, not academic lectures. But what he found surprised him. Old interviews, a few obscure blog posts, mentions that Keanu had once been passionate about science. A teacher from his high school once said, Keanu could have been a great scientist if he hadn't gone into acting. He had a way of seeing connections nobody else did. Winston leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling like the student instead of the teacher. Keanu walked out of the building, not knowing the professor was still thinking about him. He had no idea his presence in that class was already causing waves. He simply felt peace. That old spark, the love for knowledge, for problem solving, for truth, that had returned, and it made him feel young again. He was about to call a cab when he heard someone running behind him. Sir, wait. He turned to see a young woman, maybe 19, breathless, holding a notebook in her hand. Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, she said. What you did in there, it was incredible. I've been struggling with biology all semester. I felt so stupid. But the way you explained that mutation stuff, I understood it for the first time. Keanu smiled gently. You're not stupid. Sometimes it just takes a different perspective. Could you maybe help me understand more? She asked, hopeful. Keanu hesitated. He didn't come here to be anyone's tutor. But then he looked at her eyes full of struggle and hope and nodded. What's your name? He asked. Emma. Okay. Emma, let's sit down for a bit. They found a bench near a quiet fountain. Emma opened her notebook, flipping through messy pages filled with confused notes and question marks. Keanu took his time, slowly breaking down concepts: chromosomes, transcription factors, codons. He drew simple diagrams, told stories about how he used to memorize DNA sequences by creating funny songs, and explained that learning wasn't about speed. It was about understanding. Emma listened like her future depended on it. You should be a teacher, she said quietly. Keanu chuckled. I used to want to be one. They sat in silence for a moment before Emma asked, Why did you stop? His smile faded slightly. Life happened, he said. I lost someone, and after that, I wasn't the same. Emma didn't push. She just nodded, as if understanding without needing all the details. Thank you, she said. You didn't have to help me, but you did. Keanu looked at her and replied, Sometimes helping one person helps you, too. That night, a student who had been in the lecture hall posted a blurry photo of the classroom whiteboard along with the caption, Some guy in a hoodie just outsmarted Professor Winston. Pretty sure it was Keanu Reeves. Within hours, the post exploded. At first, people thought it was fake, but then more students posted about the experience. One girl wrote, I thought it was a prank until he started drawing cell pathways like a textbook came alive. News outlets picked it up. Keanu Reeves shocks met students with biology knowledge. Actor or academic, Keanu Reeves stuns classroom with genius-level answer. By morning, it was everywhere. But Keanu didn't know yet. He was sitting in a small diner near campus, sipping black coffee. reviewing a printout of the biology seminar schedule. He had circled the ones he wanted to attend next week: genome editing, cell signaling, immunotherapy. He was focused, calm, but soon his quiet little visit would no longer be quiet. Across town, Professor Winston stared at his inbox, which was filling with messages from other professors, alumni, even news reporters. "Was that really Keanu Reeves in your class? We need to talk. Are you okay? You've got to be kidding me. Can you confirm this?" He closed his laptop, overwhelmed. Then he looked at the whiteboard again. It hadn't been erased. Keanu's writing was still there, the diagram, the answer, the simplicity in which he explained the most complex question of the week. And then, something stirred in the professor. For the first time in years, he felt like learning again. Not teaching, learning. He grabbed his coat and walked toward the campus library. He had no idea that in just a few days, he would be standing next to Keanu Reeves again, not as a challenger, but as a student. But that's how change starts, with humility. And sometimes, the person who changes you is the one you tried to embarrass. The echo across the world. Keanu Reeves sat quietly at the edge of the campus garden the next morning, sipping tea from a paper cup. Birds chirped gently. The sky was soft with morning light. He had always loved mornings, when the world hadn't started rushing yet, when things still felt calm. He hadn't checked his phone. He hadn't opened the news. He didn't know the photo from the lecture had reached over 5 million views overnight. He didn't know it had become the top trending topic across social media platforms. All he knew was that he had promised Emma he'd meet her again today, and he intended to keep that promise. Back in the biology building, Professor Winston paced the corridor nervously. He had woken up to dozens of missed calls and messages. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Usually, the spotlight was on his publications, his theories, his lectures, not a mistake he had made in front of a movie star. And yet, something inside him was different now. Something was changing. Last night, he had reread several old articles on genetics, silencing, some of which he had written himself. But this time, he noticed things he hadn't before. Keanu's explanation had opened a door he didn't realize was closed. He took a deep breath and walked into his office, where a student was waiting. "Sir," the student said, holding a printout of the viral post, "the university is getting calls from journalists. They want to know if it was really him." Winston nodded slowly. Yes, it was him. The student looked shocked. "Did you know he was that smart?" Winston sighed. "No, but I should have." He stared out the window, thoughtful. "You know," he added, "some people speak softly, but when they do speak, the whole room listens." Outside, Keanu met Emma near the steps of the library. She was holding 2 coffees and a folder of notes. "You're famous now," she joked, handing him a cup. "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "You haven't checked your phone." He shook his head. She opened her tablet and turned it toward him. There, in bold letters, was the headline: "Keanu Reeves stuns MIT with brilliant biology answer. Students and professors left speechless." He stared at it quietly. Then, with a small laugh, said, "I didn't think anyone noticed." Emma smiled. "They noticed." He looked a little uncomfortable. The whole reason he had come to MIT was to feel human again, to be a student, not a star. But the attention had found him anyway. "Does this change everything?" he asked. Emma looked at him carefully. "Only if you let it." He nodded, thoughtful. They walked into the library and sat at a long wooden table near the back. As they reviewed gene editing case studies together, a small group of students began to gather nearby. A young man approached nervously. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but could I join you? I'm really struggling with RNA splicing." Keanu looked at Emma. She gave a small nod. "Pull up a chair," he said gently. Within 15 minutes, 6 more students had joined the table. Keanu didn't act like a movie star. He didn't pretend to be a professor. He just explained things the way a good friend would, patient, curious, respectful. And slowly, a quiet movement began. Students from across departments started hearing about the man in the hoodie who sat in the library and explained science better than anyone else. They started calling him the kind genius. 3 days later, Professor Winston entered that same library. He paused when he saw Keanu surrounded by students, deep in discussion over a diagram on a shared notebook. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he waited until the students left, then approached. "Mr. Reeves," he said quietly. Keanu looked up, surprised. "A professor. I came to say thank you." Keanu tilted his head, unsure. "I judged you. I tried to embarrass you. But instead, you reminded me why I love this field in the first place. I've spent too many years teaching from a place of pride. You teach from a place of love." Keanu didn't say anything for a moment. Then he softly replied, "Sometimes life breaks us open, and what spills out is who we really are." Winston's eyes glistened. "Would you consider doing a seminar with me?" he asked, something informal. "For students, you have a gift." Keanu hesitated. "I don't have credentials." "You have something better," Winston said. "You have respect." Keanu nodded slowly. "Okay, but only if it's about learning, not spotlight." "Deal." The announcement of the Humble Genius seminar spread fast. It wasn't an official class. It didn't offer credits. Yet the registration list was full within hours. On the day of the first session, the lecture hall was packed. Students sat on stairs, on the floor, even stood outside listening through the windows. It was the biggest turnout since the university's founding speaker event. Keanu stepped up to the front, holding nothing but a whiteboard marker. "This isn't about me," he said gently. "This is about what happens when we remember that science belongs to all of us, not just the ones with titles." He began drawing simple diagrams of cell division, explaining how cancer starts, not with evil but with broken instructions. How life's smallest parts mirror the struggles of people, miscommunication, mistakes, mutations, and how healing can happen, both in the body and in the soul. People listened like they had never listened before. Some took notes, some wiped tears, and somewhere in the back, Emma whispered to the girl next to her, "He's not just teaching biology. He's teaching life." What no one knew yet was that this one seminar would spark something bigger. Students would start new research groups. Professors would change their methods. And one girl, Emma, would find herself standing on a stage a year later, giving a TED Talk titled, "How a Quiet Man in a Hoodie Taught Me to Believe in Myself." But that part of the story was still waiting. For now, the world was just beginning to understand that true genius doesn't boast. It gives the storm, and the light. As the seminar series continued, something rare began happening on campus. Students started showing up early, not for grades, not for attendance, but to listen. The halls that once echoed with stress now held laughter, wonder, and questions that didn't fear judgment. The news of Keanu's quiet revolution reached farther than the MIT gates. Professors from Yale, Stanford, and even Oxford began calling MIT, asking if they could attend one of the Humble Genius seminars. Some asked to speak alongside him. Others simply wanted to learn from him. And then came the call that changed everything. It was from the National Institute of Health. They were organizing a closed-door roundtable on future cancer therapies. Only top researchers were invited, but one of the directors had seen a clip of Keanu explaining gene silencing on a student's viral video. He watched it 5 times, then picked up the phone. Keanu was invited not as an observer, but as a contributor. When Professor Winston handed him the letter, Keanu stared at it for a long time. "I'm not qualified," he said. "You're more than qualified," Winston replied. "You don't have to have a degree to bring light into the room. You already do that." Keanu nodded quietly. He accepted the invitation. Meanwhile, Emma had been changing too. The shy girl who once couldn't explain basic cell division now spent her evenings tutoring her classmates. She stayed after class to help others. Students began to look up to her, not just because she understood biology, but because she listened, just like Keanu had listened to her. One evening, as they sat together reviewing a complex case study about mitochondrial diseases, she looked up at him and said, "I've never felt smart before. You gave me that." He paused. "You were always smart. You just needed someone to remind you that you mattered." Emma smiled and whispered, "That's what I want to do for others, just like you did for me." Keanu said nothing, but his eyes softened. "I think you should apply for the Young Researcher Scholarship," he added. "You're ready." Emma shook her head. "Those are for exceptional students, And you are, he said simply. She didn't argue again. But not everyone was inspired. In the biology department, there was an older professor named Dr. Nelson Hargrove. He had built his reputation on prestige, on being the smartest man in the room. He viewed education as a hierarchy, and he saw Keanu's rising influence as a threat. "We're turning this campus into a circus," Hargrove said in a meeting. "What's next? Celebrity chefs teaching chemistry. We have to protect academic standards." Professor Winston stood up slowly. "What we're protecting is ego," he said. "Keanu isn't here to replace anyone. He's here to remind us why we started teaching in the first place." Hargrove scoffed. "He doesn't belong here." But the room was already turning against him. A new spirit had entered the university, and the old guard was struggling to keep up. The night before the NIC conference, Keanu sat alone at his hotel desk. Papers and notes were scattered before him, filled with research articles he had read and annotated. He had done his homework, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he respected the opportunity. Still, he felt nervous. What if I don't belong? Then he heard a knock. It was Emma. She walked in with a small wrapped box. "I figured you'd be overthinking," she said with a smile. He opened it. Inside was a simple bracelet, beads spelling out the word clarity. "You told me once that biology brought you peace, that it made things feel clear. Wear this tomorrow. And remember, you're not here to prove anything, just to share." Keanu looked at the bracelet, then at Emma. "Thank you," he said softly. The next day, inside the grand meeting room of the National Institute of Health, some of the world's most brilliant scientists sat around a long table. They wore tailored suits, carried digital tablets, and spoke in rapid-fire medical terms. And into that room walked Keanu Reeves, in a simple black shirt, wearing a handmade bracelet. A few people stared. Some recognized him. Others whispered, unsure why he was there. But when the director introduced him, "Our guest today brings not a list of academic degrees, but something equally important, the ability to communicate biology with heart," the room grew quiet. Keanu stepped forward, took a deep breath, and began. He didn't start with data. He started with a story about a patient who was misdiagnosed because her doctor didn't understand how her gene expression had changed from environmental trauma, how healing requires both knowledge and empathy, and how sometimes the body isn't just fighting disease, it's trying to speak. He then connected this to the importance of integrative research, bringing psychology, genetics, and even social science into the biology lab. His words weren't flashy. They were real. When he finished, the room didn't clap. They sat in silence. And then one of the senior researchers said, "We need more people like him in science." Another added, "We forgot that biology is about life, not just numbers." That night, as Keanu walked back to his room, he passed by a small group of interns gathered near the elevator. One of them, barely 20, stopped him. "Sir," she said shyly, "I grew up thinking I'd never be smart enough to do science. My dad worked at a gas station. We never had books at home. But today, listening to you, it made me feel like maybe I can belong here." Keanu looked at her, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already do." What Keanu didn't know was that the video of his talk had been recorded and was already being shared by attendees. Before sunrise, it would be seen by millions, and the quiet movement he had started would become a global call for change. But for now, all he knew was that he had worn a bracelet that reminded him of peace. And that he had helped one more person believe in themselves. The challenge of legacy. Morning after the knee roundtable, Keanu Reeves opened his email to a flood of new messages. Some were from universities inviting him to speak. Some came from parents thanking him for inspiring their children. But one message stood out. It was from a woman named Dr. Leela Saran, a molecular biologist in India. Her message was simple. "I watched your talk. My son has a rare genetic disorder, and no one understands it. But the way you explained gene silencing gave me hope. If you ever come to Mumbai, my door is open." Keanu sat quietly for a moment, reading her words over and over. He had come to MIT for peace, but now the world was calling. And in a way, it felt like this path had found him, not for fame, not for praise, but because something deep inside him Had been waiting all these years to reconnect with meaning. Back at MIT, Emma was in the biology lab, working harder than ever, inspired by Keanu's clarity. She had submitted a proposal for a student-led research project, Understanding Emotional Trauma's Impact on Gene Expression. She thought it might be rejected, but instead, she was called into a meeting with the dean. "Your idea is bold," the dean said, "and it's the kind of thinking this world needs. We're approving your grant." Emma walked out of the office holding back tears. For the first time, someone had believed in her before she succeeded. And behind every sentence she had written in that proposal, she could feel Keanu's quiet guidance. Not his voice but his presence, his belief. But not everyone was celebrating. Professor Hargrove, who had long opposed the attention Keanu was getting, had been gathering allies. He believed in tradition, and in his eyes, Keanu's growing influence was a danger to academic credibility. "We can't allow this man to redefine science. Education," he said in a closed-door meeting. "He has no degree, no publications. He's not a scientist, he's a performer." But others disagreed. "He may not be a scientist by title," one professor replied, "but he's done more for curiosity and compassion than most of us with PhDs. Still, Hargrove pushed back. And then came the moment he had been waiting for. He announced a public debate and open challenge to KeanuReeves. The topic, the ethical implications of gene editing technologies. It would be hosted by the university, with an audience of students, scientists, and media. His goal was clear, to expose Keanu's lack of formal knowledge and discredit the movement growing around him. When Keanu heard about the debate, he didn't flinch. Emma was furious. "They're trying to humiliate you. It's okay," Keanu said softly. "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand. But I won't. Fight fear with ego. So you'll do it?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, not to win, but to share." The night of the debate arrived. The auditorium was packed. Professor Hargrove stood at one podium, dressed sharply, eyes burning with determination. Beside him were stacks of notes, graphs, citations he had come prepared to crush Keanu with. Data. Keanu walked to the other podium in a simple black sweater. No notes, no laptop. Just a calm expression and that same beaded bracelet. The moderator introduced the topic, then gave the floor to Hargrove. Hargrove's opening statement was sharp, technical, impressive. He cited studies, quoted bioethicists, and painted a picture of danger if gene editing wasn't handled by qualified experts. "Science," he said loudly, "belongs to the trained, not the talented." The crowd was silent. Then it was Keanu's turn. He stepped forward and looked at the audience not just with his eyes, but with presence. "Science belongs to everyone," he said gently, "because life belongs to everyone." He spoke not from textbooks, but from the heart. He told the story of Dr. Leela Sarin and her son. He shared how real families, not just labs, live with the consequences of what scientists decide. He explained how compassion and understanding must walk hand in hand with innovation, and how every voice from the scholar to the street cleaner deserves to be heard. When the future of humanity is being shaped, he didn't try to win. He tried to connect. And he did. At the end of the debate, the crowd didn't just clap, they stood, some cried. Even a few professors wiped their eyes, and Professor Hargrove, he stood frozen, not because he had been defeated by logic, but because something in Keanu's words had pierced the armor of his pride. After the event, as people gathered around Keanu to thank him, a quiet girl approached the stage. She wore a school uniform and held a biology notebook against her chest. "Sir," she whispered, "I want to be a geneticist someday, but I come from a small town. We don't have labs or computers. I thought people like me couldn't do science." Keanu knelt to her level and said, "Then let's prove the world wrong together." She nodded, smiling through tears. The next day, Emma received an email. Her research project had been selected to be presented at an international conference in Europe. In the corner of the email, a small note was added. "This project represents the spirit of the Humble Genius Seminar." She ran to tell Keanu, but he was already on the phone with Dr. Leela Sarin. He had booked a flight to Mumbai. He didn't want to just talk about science anymore. He wanted to use it. What he didn't know was that his trip to India would change not only a family but a country. Because sometimes legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you awaken in others. The return of wonder. When Keanu Reeves landed in Mumbai, the air felt different. It wasn't just the heat or the chaos of horns and voices. It was the energy, the raw, living energy of a place where hope and hardship walk side by side. The streets were crowded, the colors vibrant, and every face told a story. He had come to visit Dr. Leela Saran not as a celebrity, not as a guest of honor, but as a student of life. Her home was small, tucked between a clinic and a market. Her son, a shy boy named Arjun, greeted Keanu at the door. He was 8 years old, with large eyes that carried too much pain for his age. Arjun's condition was rare, a genetic disorder that made his muscles weak and his bones fragile. Most doctors had dismissed his case as unsolvable, but Dr. Saran had never stopped trying. Keanu spent 3 days with them. They didn't just talk science, they talked humanity. They looked at Arjun's gene reports together, walked through treatment options, and even built a small model using Lego bricks to help Arjun understand his own DNA. Keanu told stories about cells that made mistakes and learned to fix themselves, about proteins that helped heal, and about how the smallest parts of life could be the strongest. On the final night, Arjun looked up at him and asked, "Will I ever be able to run?" Keanu paused, then placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Maybe not today," he said gently, "but if we don't give up, maybe someday. And even if your legs can't run yet, your spirit already does." When Keanu left India, something had changed in him. He didn't feel like a visitor anymore. He felt like a bridge between worlds, between hearts, between science and soul. And as he flew back to Boston, he thought of all the people he had met on this journey: Emma, Professor Winston, Dr. Saran, Arjun, and even those who once doubted him. But the real story was just beginning, because what had started as one man answering a question on a whiteboard had become a global movement. Back at MIT, Emma stood on stage at the International Research Conference in Switzerland. She looked out at a sea of brilliant minds: students, scientists, educators. Her voice trembled as she began. "1 year ago, I thought I was too ordinary to be here. I couldn't understand biology. I had no confidence. And then someone sat with me on a bench. He didn't give me answers. He gave me belief." She paused, then continued. "This project was inspired by that belief, and by a man who showed us that science isn't just about facts. It's about people." Her presentation exploring how emotional trauma can trigger gene expression changes received a standing ovation. Her name was published in major journals, and she was offered a spot in a top research program in London. When she emailed Keanu to tell him, he replied with only 2 words: "Keep going." Months passed. Keanu never returned to Hollywood. Instead, he traveled from universities in Africa to hospitals in rural China, from refugee schools in Turkey to youth science camps in Brazil. He spoke not to teach, but to remind people they mattered, that curiosity had no borders, and that wonder was for everyone. He created a non-profit called Clarity, named after the bracelet Emma gave him. It brought science education to forgotten places, built mobile labs, trained teachers, funded research for diseases that the world had ignored. Within 2 years, Clarity reached 20 countries. Within 5, it had changed thousands of lives. Back at MIT, a statue was quietly placed near the garden where he once sat sipping tea. It wasn't large, it wasn't golden, it was simple: a stone bench, engraved with a single quote: "Science belongs to everyone, because life belongs to everyone." Our students began calling it the bench of wonder. They would sit there before exams, during hard weeks, when they needed to remember why they had started, and every once in a while, a quiet man in a hoodie would visit the campus again. He wouldn't speak. He'd just smile and sit for a while, then disappear before anyone could gather round. Because, for him, it was never about being seen. It was about seeing others. In the end, Keanu Reeves didn't change the world with fame or fortune. He changed it with humility, with kindness. With the courage to be simple in a world that worships complexity. And, in doing so, he gave science back to the people, not just in labs, but in hearts.